Story 1. Phantom hitchhiker of Route 66. She left behind the smell of a lightning strike and a $20 bill that crumbled to ash when I touched it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because what happened on Route 66 near Villa Ridge has been eating at me for 3 weeks now, and I need to tell someone before it drives me completely insane. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been driving freight across the Midwest for 8 years. I know every truck stop, every shortcut, every speed trap between Kansas City and St. Louis. What I done, do you know, is how to explain what happened that night when I picked up a woman who shouldn't have existed. It was October 15th, just past midnight. I was hauling electronics from Kansas City to a warehouse in Fenton, running about an hour behind schedule because of construction delays outside Columbia. The rain had been coming down hard all evening, turning Route 66 into a ribbon of slick asphalt that reflected my headlights like black ice. I was maybe 10 miles past Villa Ridge when I saw her standing beside the road. She was small, maybe 5'4", wearing a thin summer dress that was completely soaked through. Her dark hair hung in wet strings around her shoulders, and she was shivering so violently I could see it from 50 yards away. One arm was extended with her thumb out, the universal signal of someone desperate for a ride. Now, I don't normally pick up hitchhikers. Company policy strictly forbids it, and after 8 years of listening to trucking horror stories, I know better than to let strangers into my cab. But this girl looked like she was about to die from exposure. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and that summer dress might as well have been made of tissue paper. I pulled over about 30 feet past her and watched in my mirror as she jogged toward my truck. Her movements were awkward, like someone who was so cold they could barely coordinate their muscles. When she reached the passenger door, I rolled down my window. She looked up at me with the largest, darkest eyes I had ever seen. Her skin was pale as paper, with a bluish tint around her lips that suggested the early stages of hypothermia. But when she spoke, her voice was soft and clear, without the chattering teeth I expected. She asked if I could give her a ride to an address in Villa Ridge. Said her car had broken down about a mile back, and her cell phone was dead. She was so cold, she kept saying, so very cold. Against every rule and instinct I had developed over 8 years of long-haul trucking, I told her to climb in. She moved with surprising grace for someone who looked half frozen. One moment she was standing in the rain beside my truck. The next she was settling into the passenger seat with barely a sound. The only thing that marked her presence was the sudden drop in temperature inside the cab. I cranked the heat up to maximum and pulled back onto Route 66. The girl sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Steam rose from her wet clothes, but instead of warming the air, it seemed to make everything colder. I tried to make conversation, asking where she was from, what had happened to her car, whether she needed me to call someone. But she only repeated the same phrase over and over. She was so cold. Her voice never changed inflection, never showed any emotion beyond a kind of distant sadness. The address she had given me was on Elm Street, supposedly a residential area on the outskirts of Villa Ridge. I knew the town fairly well from years of driving through it, but I couldn't place the street name. When I mentioned this, she simply repeated the address and said it would be on the right. As we drove, I started noticing strange things about my passenger. She never blinked. Her chest didn't rise and fall with breathing. And despite being soaked to the skin, she wasn't dripping water onto the seat. The moisture seemed to evaporate before it could fall, leaving only that persistent chill and a smell like the air after a thunderstorm. The GPS on my dashboard couldn't locate the address she had given me. When I told her this, she turned to look at me for the first time since getting into the truck. Her dark eyes seemed to contain depths that went far beyond what should have been possible in a human face. She pointed ahead and said the turn was just past the old Tri-County truck stop. I knew the Tri-County. It had been abandoned for at least 5 years, maybe longer. The place was a local landmark of sorts, a massive complex that had once served as a major stopping point for truckers traveling Route 66. But the interstate had redirected most of the traffic, and the truck stop had slowly died. Last time I had driven past, the buildings were dark and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. Sure enough, we crested a small hill and the abandoned truck stop came into view. Even in the darkness, I could make out the skeletal remains of the main building, its broken windows staring out like empty eye sockets. The towering sign that had once advertised fuel prices and hot food now tilted at a dangerous angle, held up by rust and stubbornness. Just past the truck stop, The girl pointed to a narrow road that branched off to the right. There was no street sign, but she insisted this was Elm Street. I turned onto what looked more like a farm access road than a residential street. The pavement was older here, full of potholes and covered with fallen leaves that had turned to mush in the rain. My headlights illuminated a landscape that seemed frozen in time. Mailboxes that leaned at odd angles, driveways that led to houses hidden behind overgrown trees, the occasional glimpse of a porch light glowing through the darkness like a distant star. We drove for maybe half a mile before the girl told me to stop. She pointed to a mailbox that stood beside a gravel driveway, its numbers barely visible through years of weather and neglect. Beyond it, I could make out the outline of a small house set back among the trees. I pulled over and put the truck in park. When I turned to ask if she needed help getting to the door, the passenger seat was empty. Not just empty, it was dry. No sign that a soaking wet person had been sitting there for the past 20 minutes. No puddles on the floor, no moisture on the seat back, nothing. The only evidence of her presence was the lingering cold and that strange smell of ozone that made my nose tingle. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped out of the cab, thinking maybe she had already gotten out and was walking toward the house. But the driveway was empty, and there were no footprints in the soft gravel. The rain continued to fall steadily, washing away any traces that might have existed. I called out, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. The only response was the sound of rain pattering on leaves and the distant hum of traffic on Route 66. That's when I noticed the house. Even in the darkness, I could tell it was abandoned. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split from years of exposure. The roof sagged in several places, and the front porch had partially collapsed. Tall grass grew up around the foundation, and vines covered most of the walls. No one had lived there for years, maybe decades. I walked up the driveway with my flashlight, looking for any sign of recent activity. The front door hung open on broken hinges, revealing an interior that was clearly uninhabitable. Debris covered the floors, and I could smell mold and decay even from outside. But on the doorframe, carved deep into the wood, was a name, Sarah Kellerman, 1987 to 2004. 17 years old when she died, the same age the girl in my truck had appeared to be. I backed away from the house, my heart pounding. This was impossible. I had given a ride to a dead girl, transported a ghost for 20 minutes through the Missouri countryside. And she had been so real, so solid. She had spoken to me, pointed directions, sat in my passenger seat. I stumbled back to my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. But before I could put it in drive, I saw something on the passenger seat that stopped my breath. A $20 bill, carefully folded and placed exactly where she had been sitting. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper felt old, brittle, like currency that had been out of circulation for years. But in the dim light of the cab, I could make out the design and printing that marked it as genuine legal tender. As I held it up to examine it more closely, the bill began to crumble. The edges turned to ash first. Then the decomposition spread inward until the entire thing disintegrated in my hands. Within seconds, there was nothing left but a small pile of gray dust on my palm. I blew the ash out the window and drove away as fast as I could safely manage on the rain-slick roads. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. Maybe the rain and darkness had played tricks on my perception. Maybe the stress of running behind schedule had caused some kind of hallucination. But I couldn't explain the physical evidence. The temperature drop in my cab had been real. The smell of ozone had been unmistakable. And that $20 bill, however briefly it had existed, had been solid enough to pick up and examine. I started researching Sarah Kellerman online, using the name I had seen carved into the doorframe. What I found made my blood run cold. Sarah had died in a car accident on Route 66 near Villa Ridge on October 15, 2004. Exactly 17 years to the day before I had picked up my mysterious passenger. She had been driving home from a friend's house during a rainstorm when she lost control on the wet pavement and crashed into a tree. The accident report said she had been found still wearing a summer dress, despite the cold weather. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of the story. According to local news archives, Sarah Kellerman had been picked up by at least a dozen different drivers over the years since her death. The accounts were remarkably consistent. A young woman in a summer dress, soaking wet, asking for a ride to an address on Elm Street. She always said she was cold. She always disappeared before reaching her destination, and she always left behind the smell of ozone and a $20 bill that turned to ash. The local paper had even run a feature story about the phenomenon, interviewing several truckers and motorists who claimed to have given rides to Sarah's ghost. Most of them were like me, professional drivers with clean records and no history of mental health issues. People who had no reason to make up stories about supernatural encounters. But the really unsettling detail was buried in the police reports. Every driver who had picked up Sarah Kellerman reported the same experience with the $20 bill. And when investigators had examined Sarah's effects after her death, they found her wallet contained exactly $20 in cash. She had been trying to pay for rides with her own death money for 17 years. I tried to put the experience behind me and return to my normal routes. But over the following weeks, other truckers started sharing their own stories about Route 66 near Villa Ridge. The tales were always similar: a young woman in distress, asking for help, then vanishing without explanation. Some drivers claimed to have seen her multiple times, always on rainy nights, always around the anniversary of her death. Others reported that after giving her a ride, they experienced a string of mechanical problems or traffic delays, as if something was trying to keep them on that stretch of highway longer than necessary. A few drivers had tried to investigate, returning to the area to look for answers. They described finding the abandoned house exactly as I had, complete with Sarah's name carved into the doorframe. But some claimed the house looked different each time they visited, as if it was slowly decaying in reverse, returning to the state it had been in when Sarah was alive. One trucker told me he had visited the site during daylight hours and found the house in perfect condition, with fresh paint and manicured landscaping. But when he returned that same evening, it was abandoned again, looking like it had been empty for decades. I didn't believe that particular story until I decided to see for myself. 3 weeks after my encounter with Sarah, I timed my route to pass through Villa Ridge during the day. I found Elm Street easily in the daylight, following the same path I had taken that rainy night. But when I reached the address where I had dropped off my phantom passenger, I found something that defied every rational explanation. The house was pristine, fresh white paint-covered walls that had been rotted and vine-covered in the darkness. The roof was intact, the windows were clear and unbroken, and the front porch looked like it had been built yesterday. A neat garden bordered the walkway, and a small American flag hung from a bracket beside the front door. I parked my truck and walked up to examine the doorframe where I had seen Sarah's name carved into the wood. The surface was smooth and unmarked, painted white like the rest of the house. But as I stood there in the afternoon sunlight, I could feel the temperature dropping around me. The smell of ozone began to fill the air, growing stronger with each breath. And somewhere behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps on gravel. I turned to see Sarah Kellerman walking up the driveway toward me. She looked exactly as she had that night in my truck. But now I could see her clearly in the daylight. Her summer dress was pale blue with small white flowers, the kind of outfit a teenage girl might wear to a school dance or family barbecue. Her dark hair was dry now, styled in soft waves that framed her young face. She walked right up to me and stopped, those impossibly deep eyes meeting mine with an expression of infinite sadness. For the first time since I had met her, she spoke more than a few words. Her voice was clear and strong, without the distant quality it had possessed in my truck. She thanked me for bringing her home. She said most drivers were too frightened to complete the journey, that they would stop and let her out as soon as they realized something was wrong. But I had been kind enough to take her all the way to her door. She explained that she had been trying to get home for 17 years, catching rides from anyone willing to help. But the house existed in a kind of temporal loop, flickering between the way it had been when she was alive and the way it was now, decades after her death. Only on certain nights, under certain conditions, could she manifest clearly enough to interact with the living world. She was trapped, she said, between life and death, unable to move on because she had died so far from home. All she wanted was to walk through her own front door one more time, to feel safe and warm in the place where she had been happiest. But every time she tried to enter the house, she found herself back on Route 66, starting the whole process over again. I asked if there was anything I could do to help her find peace. She smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness I had seen from her. She said I had already done enough. By completing the ride, by bringing her all the way home instead of abandoning her when things got strange, I had given her something precious. Proof that kindness still existed in the world. The $20 bill, she explained, was her way of trying to pay for the rides. It was the money she had been carrying when she died, and it was all she had to offer. But death money couldn't to survive in the living world for very long. It always crumbled to ash eventually. As she spoke, the house behind her began to change. The fresh paint started to fade and peel. The windows grew cloudy, then dark. The roof sagged inward, and vines began creeping up the walls. Within minutes, the structure had returned to the abandoned ruin I had seen that first night. Sarah looked back at the decaying building with deep sadness, then turned to me one final time. She said she knew now that she would never truly make it home. The house was gone. Her family was gone, and the world had moved on without her. But she was grateful for the rides, for the brief moments of human connection that reminded her she had once been real. She walked backward toward the house, never taking her eyes off me. With each step, she became more translucent, until she was nothing more than a whisper of movement in the afternoon air. But just before she disappeared completely, she raised her hand in a small wave goodbye. I stood there for a long time after she vanished, staring at the abandoned house and trying to process what I had experienced. Eventually, I walked back to my truck and continued on my route, but my mind kept returning to that final conversation. Sarah Kellerman had been trying to get home for 17 years, and I had helped her realize that home no longer existed. In trying to show her kindness, I had inadvertently delivered the most devastating news possible. She was truly and completely alone. Over the next few weeks, I found myself checking online forums and trucker bulletin boards, looking for recent sightings of the phantom hitchhiker near Villa Ridge. But the reports had stopped. No one had seen Sarah since my daylight encounter with her. I wondered if our conversation had finally given her the closure she needed to move on, or if the realization that her home was gone forever had somehow broken the loop that kept her trapped on Route 66. I'll never know for sure, but sometimes, when I am driving through Missouri on rainy October nights, I find myself slowing down near the old Tri-County truck stop, just in case she is still out there, still looking for someone kind enough to give her a ride home. Because if she is, I'll stop. Every time. Some journeys are worth taking, even when you know they lead nowhere. Story 2. Black dog of I-77. The dog saved my life, and I didn't even know I was dying. That is what haunts me most about what happened on Interstate 77 near Charlotte 3 months ago. Not the glowing red eyes or the way it materialized out of nothing on the dark asphalt ahead of my rig. Not even the local legend I learned about afterward. The story of a trucker, this loyal companion that refuses to let drivers make the same fatal mistake its owner did. What keeps me awake at night is the realization that I was seconds away from becoming another highway statistic, and something that shouldn't exist intervened to save a life it had never met. My name is Rick Donovan, and I've been hauling freight for 15 years. I know the difference between road fatigue hallucinations and reality. I know what microsleep looks like, how your brain starts playing tricks when you've been pushing too hard for too long. What I saw that night wasn't a hallucination. It was a warning. I was 3 days into a coast-to-coast run, hauling auto parts from Seattle to a distribution center in Greensboro. The load was time-sensitive, and my dispatcher had been riding me hard about delivery schedules. I had pushed through my legally mandated rest periods twice, catching catnaps in truck stop parking lots instead of taking the full 10-hour breaks required by federal regulations. By the time I reached the Charlotte area, I was running on nothing but caffeine and stubbornness. My eyes felt like they were full of sand, and my hands had developed a slight tremor from too much coffee and too little sleep. But I was only 4 hours from the delivery point, and the bonus for on-time delivery would cover my daughter's college textbooks for the semester. The digital clock on my dashboard showed 2:43 a.m. when I merged onto I-77 south from the Charlotte bypass. Traffic was light, just the occasional car or truck sharing the 4-lane highway with me. The road stretched ahead like a black river under the scattered streetlights, and I found myself fighting to keep my eyes focused on the white lines marking my lane. That is when microsleep hit me for the first time. 1 second I was driving normally. The next I was jerking awake to find my 18-wheeler drifting toward the median barrier. I corrected quickly, adrenaline flooding my system as I realized I had been unconscious for several seconds while traveling at 70 miles per hour. I should have pulled over immediately. Should have found the nearest truck stop and taken a mandatory rest break. But the delivery deadline loomed in my mind like a threat, and I convinced myself I could make it another hour before stopping. I cranked up the air conditioning, opened both windows to let the October night air blast through the cab, and turned the radio to a talk show with hosts who were arguing loudly about politics. anything to keep my brain engaged and alert. For the next 20 minutes, I managed to stay focused. I counted mile markers, read every road sign aloud, even started doing multiplication tables in my head. But fatigue is a patient enemy. It waits for your defenses to drop, then strikes without warning. The second microsleep episode lasted longer. I came to with my truck straddling 2 lanes, a car, its horn blaring behind me as the driver swerved to avoid rear-ending my trailer. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled back into the right lane, fully aware that I had just narrowly avoided causing a multi-vehicle accident. But instead of stopping, I made the decision that almost killed me. I reached for the thermos of coffee on my passenger seat, downed the last of the cold, bitter liquid, and kept driving. 10 minutes later, I was fighting to keep my eyes open when the black dog appeared. It materialized in the middle of my lane about 200 yards ahead, sitting perfectly still in the path of my oncoming truck. At first, I thought it was a large German shepherd that had somehow gotten loose and wandered onto the highway. But as my headlights swept over it, I realized this was no ordinary animal. The dog was massive, easily the size of a small bear. Its fur was so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a shadow-shaped hole in the illuminated roadway. But the most unsettling feature was its eyes. They glowed with a deep red light that pulsed like a heartbeat, visible even at distance. I grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and hit the brakes, expecting the animal to bolt as my truck bore down on it. Dogs, even large ones, don't typically stand their ground when 18 tons of metal comes roaring toward them. But this dog didn't move. It sat with perfect stillness, those red eyes fixed on my windshield with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight through the glass and into my skull. As I got closer, details became clearer. The dog's ears were pointed forward with alertness. Its mouth was closed, but I could see the outline of powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. Its posture was calm but ready, like a soldier at attention. 50 yards, 40, 30. I was standing on the brake pedal now, feeling my trailer start to fishtail as the air brakes fought to slow 40 tons of momentum. The dog grew larger in my windshield, but still it didn't move. 20 yards, 15. At 10 yards, I was certain I was about to commit the most horrific act of animal cruelty in trucking history. I closed my eyes, unable to watch the impact. But there was no impact. When I opened my eyes, the dog was gone. Vanished completely, as if it had never been there. My truck rolled to a stop in the middle of the empty highway, emergency flashers reflecting off the asphalt in rhythmic pulses of orange light. I sat in the sudden silence, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode. Cold sweat ran down my face despite the cool night air. That's when I realized what had really happened. The adrenaline surge from braking for the phantom dog had shocked me completely awake for the first time in hours. My vision was clear, my mind sharp, my reflexes responsive. The crushing weight of fatigue that had been dragging me toward unconsciousness was gone, replaced by hyper-alert awareness. I had been micro-sleeping while driving 70 miles per hour on a busy interstate highway. Without the intervention of that impossible black dog, I would have eventually succumbed completely to exhaustion. My truck would have drifted off the road or into oncoming traffic, killing me and potentially taking innocent lives with me. The dog had saved me from myself. I pulled my rig onto the shoulder and activated my emergency flashers. Then I climbed into the sleeper berth and crashed for 6 hours, sleeping more deeply than I had in weeks. When I woke up, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Maybe the dog had been real after all, just a stray animal that had bolted into the woods at the last second. Maybe my exhausted mind had exaggerated its size and those strange glowing eyes. But I couldn't explain how it had simply vanished. I had been looking directly at it when it disappeared. One moment it was there, solid and undeniably present. The next moment, empty highway. I completed my delivery to Greensboro without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. During my mandatory rest period, I started researching highway legends and trucker folklore, looking for any mention of phantom animals on I-77. What I found made my blood run cold. The first account dated back to 1987. A trucker named Bill Hawkins had been driving a load of furniture from Virginia to Georgia when he encountered a large black dog with glowing eyes near Charlotte. Like me, he had been fighting fatigue in microsleep episodes. The dog's appearance had shocked him awake and prompted him to pull over for a proper rest. Hawkins had shared his story on CB radio channels, and other drivers began reporting similar sightings. Always the same stretch of I-77. Always a massive black dog with red eyes. Always appearing to drivers who were dangerously tired. But the most chilling detail was buried in a 1986 newspaper archive. A trucker named Danny Morrison had died in a single-vehicle accident on I-77 near Charlotte. He had been driving for 26 straight hours when his rig crossed the median and rolled over. The accident report mentioned that Morrison's German Shepherd, a dog named Duke, had been riding in the cab and was killed in the crash. According to the article, Morrison had been a beloved figure in the trucking community, known for his safety advocacy and his insistence that drivers follow federal rest regulations. His dog Duke had been his constant companion for 8 years, traveling hundreds of thousands of miles together. The accident had been entirely preventable. Morrison had been pushing himself beyond safe limits to meet a delivery deadline, exactly the kind of dangerous behavior he had spent years warning other drivers to avoid. After reading Danny Morrison's story, I started paying attention to online trucking forums and CB radio chatter. The reports of the black dog were more common than I had imagined. At least 24 drivers claimed to have encountered the phantom animal over the past 3 decades, always under similar circumstances. Sleep-deprived drivers approaching the danger zone of complete exhaustion would see the dog appear in their path. The shock of the encounter would jolt them awake and force them to stop for rest. None of them reported actually hitting the animal. It always vanished at the last possible moment. But the most disturbing pattern was what happened to drivers who ignored the warning. I found records of 17 fatigue-related accidents on that same stretch of I-77 since 1987. All single-vehicle crashes, all involving drivers who had been awake for extended periods. The accident reports consistently mentioned that witnesses had seen the victims' trucks weaving erratically or drifting between lanes in the minutes before the crashes. Several surviving drivers from non-fatal accidents reported seeing a large black dog on the highway shortly before they lost control. But unlike the drivers who stopped and rested, these individuals had continued driving despite the warning. The dog wasn't just appearing randomly. It was targeting specific drivers at specific moments, the exact point where fatigue became fatal. I started asking other truckers about their experiences, carefully bringing up the subject during conversations at truck stops and rest areas. The responses were mixed. Some drivers laughed off the whole thing as highway mythology. Others grew quiet and changed the subject. But a few shared their own encounters with Danny Morrison, his phantom companion. Earl Jenkins told me about seeing the dog in 1994, when he was a rookie driver pushing too hard on his first long-haul run. The shock of the encounter had made him realize he was literally falling asleep at the wheel. Maria Santos described a 2003 incident where the dog had appeared during a blizzard, when she was fighting both exhaustion and dangerous weather conditions. The sighting had convinced her to find immediate shelter rather than continue driving. Every story followed the same pattern. Dangerously tired drivers. A massive black dog with glowing red eyes. A vanishing act that left the witnesses questioning their sanity but ultimately alive. The legend had evolved over the years into something like a guardian spirit of the highway. Truckers started referring to sightings as getting a visit from Duke, Danny Morrison, his loyal companion who couldn't bear to watch other drivers make the same fatal mistake his master had. Some drivers claimed they had started talking to Duke during their encounters, thanking him for the warning. Others left offerings at the mile marker where Danny Morrison had died, dog biscuits, water bowls, even small American flags to honor a driver who had given his life to teach others about the importance of safety. I became obsessed with understanding the phenomenon. During my next run through Charlotte, I timed my trip to pass the area around 3 a.m., the same time frame when most sightings occurred. I was well rested and alert, having taken a full 10-hour break at a truck stop in Virginia. But as I approached the spot where I had encountered the dog 3 weeks earlier, I found myself watching the road ahead with intense anticipation. Mile marker 23, mile marker 22, mile marker 21. At mile marker 20, I saw him. This time, the dog was standing on the shoulder rather than in the middle of the road. He was just as massive as I remembered, a shadow black figure with eyes like glowing coals. But his posture was different. Instead of the alert attention he had shown during our first encounter, he appeared relaxed, almost casual. As I drove past, he turned his head to watch my truck. For just a moment, our eyes met through the passenger side window. There was intelligence in that gaze, a depth of understanding that no ordinary animal could possess. Then he was behind me, disappearing into my mirrors as I continued south toward my destination. But this encounter felt different. There had been no urgency, no warning. It was more like a greeting, an acknowledgement between old acquaintances. Duke had recognized me as a driver who had heeded his first warning, and he was simply letting me know he was still on duty, still watching over the highway he and his master had traveled together. Over the following months, I changed my driving habits completely. I started taking proper rest breaks, planning my routes to avoid the pressure of unrealistic delivery deadlines, and monitoring my fatigue levels with obsessive attention. But I also started carrying something new in my truck, a bag of premium dog biscuits and a small bowl that one kept filled with fresh water. Not because I expected to encounter Duke again, but because I wanted to be prepared if I did. A small gesture of gratitude for a phantom companion who had saved my life and taught me the difference between being tough and being smart. I've driven past that stretch of I-77 dozens of times since my first encounter. I've seen Duke twice more, both times when I was properly rested and driving safely. Each sighting felt like a brief reunion, a moment of connection between the living and the dead across the void that separates our worlds. But I also started noticing other things. Fresh tire marks where vehicles have pulled onto the shoulder around mile marker 20. Empty dog food cans left at the base of the mile marker post. Small memorials that appear and disappear, left by drivers who understand what really happened to Danny Morrison and his faithful companion in 1986. The trucking community has its own way of honoring those who came before us. We tell their stories, we learn from their mistakes, and we remember their sacrifices. Duke has become part of that tradition, a legend that serves a vital purpose, reminding drivers that no deadline is worth dying for. 3 months have passed since my first encounter with the black dog of I-77. I'm a different driver now, more careful, more aware of my limitations. I've passed the story along to other truckers, sharing the legend and its life-saving message. Because that is what Duke would want. That is what Danny Morrison died trying to teach us. That the most important delivery a trucker can make is arriving home safely to the people who love us. And sometimes, when the highway gets dark and lonely, when the pressure builds to push just a little harder, drive just a little longer, I remember those glowing red eyes and the lesson they taught me. Some warnings come from the most unexpected sources, and the smartest drivers are the ones who know when to listen. Story 3. Ghost in the way station. I never believed in ghosts until that night at the Millfield way station. 23 years hauling freight across America, and I thought I'd seen everything the highway could throw at me. I was wrong. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. Dispatch needed someone to take an emergency load from Chicago to Denver. The regular driver had called in sick, and the cargo was time-sensitive medical equipment. Double pay for the overnight haul. I should have said no. Should have stayed in my warm bunk at the truck stop instead of climbing into that cold cab. The first 8 hours went smooth. Interstate 80 stretched out like a black ribbon under my headlights, nothing but darkness and the occasional pair of taillights in the distance. The radio played old country songs that kept me company as mile markers ticked by. Everything normal, everything safe. Then I hit the construction zone outside of Grand Island, Nebraska. Orange cones forced traffic into a single lane, backing up semis for miles. My fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and my logbook said I had maybe 2 hours left before I'd be illegal to drive. That is when I spotted the exit sign I'd never seen before, even after 2 decades running this road. Millfield Way Station 2. The name didn't ring a bell, but way stations sometimes had fuel pumps, and I needed both gas and a mandatory rest break. I took the exit, following a narrow 2-lane road that curved through thick pine trees. No other trucks ahead of me, no headlights behind me, just my rig and the darkness pressing in from both sides. The trees opened up after about a mile, revealing a strange sight. The way station sat in a clearing, but it wasn't like any I'd ever seen. The building looked old, really old, with brick walls and tall windows that belonged in a different century. Railroad tracks ran right alongside the structure, though they looked abandoned, with weeds growing between the rusted rails. A weathered sign by the entrance read, Millfield Depot, Est, 1923, renovated for commercial use. Someone had converted an old train station into a way station. Made sense, I guess. Both dealt with heavy cargo and had the infrastructure for weighing loads. I pulled my rig onto the scale and set the air brakes. The building had lights on inside, casting yellow rectangles across the cracked asphalt. Through the windows, I could see an attendant behind a desk, his head down, working on paperwork. At least someone was awake to help me figure out where I could fuel up. That is when I saw the man with the lantern. He was walking along the railroad tracks, maybe 50 yards from my truck. Moving slowly, deliberately, like he was inspecting the rails. The lantern he carried wasn't electric. It was one of those old-fashioned kerosene ones that railroad workers used to use, with a wire handle and glass chimney. The flame flickered yellow and orange as he moved. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, you okay out there?" The man didn't respond. Didn't even look up. Just kept walking his slow, methodical pace along the tracks, lantern swinging gently at his side. He wore what looked like old work clothes. Heavy jacket, thick boots, a cap pulled low over his face. Everything about him seemed wrong for 2019, like he stepped out of an old photograph. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the station building. The night air was colder than it should have been for October in Nebraska, and I could see my breath forming little clouds as I approached the door. Behind me, I could still see the lantern bobbing along the tracks. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the renovation hadn't touched much of the original character. High tin ceilings, wooden benches along the walls, and old-fashioned ticket windows that had been converted into service counters. The smell hit me immediately. Coal smoke and machine oil, like the building remembered its railroad days. The attendant looked up from his paperwork. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His uniform shirt had a patch that read, Nebraska. But everything about his manner seemed weary, like he'd been working this job for decades. "Evening," I said. "Got a truck on your scale. Also wondering if you know where I can fuel up around here. And hey, there's some guy walking around on those tracks outside with a lantern. Might want to check on him." The attendant nodded slowly, like he heard this before. He glanced toward the windows, then back at me. "You saw him too?" "Huh?" Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "What do you mean, too?" Instead of answering, he stood up and walked to the wall behind his desk. Hanging there was a collection of old photographs, the kind you see in small-town museums. Black and white pictures of the station in its railroad days. Men in work clothes standing beside steam engines, passengers waiting on benches with their luggage. He pointed to one photograph in particular. The caption read, Millfield Depot Staff 1947. 5 men stood in front of the building, which looked exactly the same as it did now. One man stood slightly apart from the others, holding a railroad lantern. Same jacket, same cap, same methodical posture I'd seen outside. "That is Henry Morrison," the attendant said. "Night inspector. Worked these tracks for 37 years, checking for loose rails, damaged ties, anything that might cause a derailment. Saved a lot of lives with his diligence." I stared at the photograph. The resemblance to the man I'd seen was perfect. Too perfect. When was this taken? 1947. 3 months before Henry died in a rail accident right out there. The attendant pointed toward the tracks. Locomotive hit a washout during a storm. Henry was doing his evening inspection when it happened. Found him the next morning, lantern still burning beside the tracks. My mouth went dry. That was 70 years ago. Yep, but Henry never stopped making his rounds. Folks see him most nights, especially truckers who stop here. Always the same, walking the rails, checking for problems, carrying that lantern. Never responds when you call out to him. Never looks up, just keeps working. I wanted to laugh it off. Tell him he was trying to spook the out-of-town driver. But I'd seen the man myself. Had called out to him. Had watched that lantern bobbing along the tracks like a firefly in the darkness. "The fuel pumps are about a mile back toward the interstate," the attendant continued, sitting back down at his desk. "Station stays open all night. You can park here and walk if you want, but I recommend getting your fuel and moving on. Henry is harmless, but some truckers find him unsettling." I thanked him and headed back outside. The night seemed darker now, more oppressive. I looked toward the tracks, expecting to see nothing, hoping my imagination had run away with me. The lantern was still there, closer now, maybe 30 yards from my truck. Henry Morrison, if that was who it was, had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still beside the tracks, lantern held at his side. Even in the darkness, I could make out his silhouette clearly. The cap, the jacket, the careful, professional posture of a man who took his job seriously. I climbed back into my cab and started the engine, but I couldn't stop watching him. As my headlights swept across the area, they seemed to pass right through him, like he was made of mist. But the lantern remained solid, real, casting its warm yellow glow on the weeds and rusted rails. I put the truck in gear and started to pull away from the scale. That's when Henry finally looked up. His face was pale, ancient, with hollow eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal's. But there was intelligence there, and something else. Recognition. Like he knew I could see him, knew I was one of the few who had witnessed his eternal rounds. He raised the lantern slightly, not quite a wave but an acknowledgement. Then he turned back to the tracks and resumed walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlight beams. I found the fuel station and filled up, hands shaking as I worked the pump. The attendant there was young, chatty, normal. When I mentioned the way station, he just nodded. Oh, that old place. Yeah, but keeps it running for overflow traffic. Weird building, right? Used to be a train depot back in the day. Some old-timer died there in the 40s or something. Locals say he still shows up sometimes, but you know how small-town stories go. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. The rest of the drive to Denver passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of Henry Morrison walking those tracks. When I got back to Chicago, I did some research. Found newspaper articles from 1947 about the rail accident. Henry had been 53 when he died, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. The articles called him a dedicated employee who had prevented numerous accidents through his careful inspections. One detail stuck with me. The night he died, Henry had called in a report about a potential washout just minutes before the locomotive came through. The engineer hadn't received the message in time to stop, but Henry's warning saved the passenger train that was scheduled to follow. Even in death, he was still protecting people. I've driven past that exit dozens of times since then. Sometimes I take the detour, park at the scale, and watch the tracks. Henry is always there, making his rounds, checking for dangers that could harm the trains that no longer run. The current attendant told me something interesting on my last visit. The Nebraska DOT has been trying to close that way station for years. It's not cost-effective, too far off the main highway, barely used. But every time they propose shutting it down, something goes wrong. Equipment failures, budget issues, bureaucratic delays. It's like the station doesn't want to close. Like it knows Henry needs this place to continue his work. I understand now why he raised that lantern when I first saw him. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was gratitude. In a world that has forgotten the railroad age, where few people remember the dedication of men like Henry Morrison, he was thankful that someone still saw him, still recognized his service. Some nights, when I'm running late freight through Nebraska, I take that exit on purpose. I park my rig on the scale and watch Henry make his careful inspection of the tracks. There's something comforting about it, knowing that even death can stop a man from doing his job, from protecting people he'll never meet. But I always make sure to leave before dawn, because I have a feeling that Henry Morrison's story is just one of many that haunt our highways. And some of those stories might not be as benevolent as a dedicated railroad man ensuring safe passage. The roads are full of ghosts, carrying their unfinished business through the darkness. Most drivers never see them, never look beyond their headlight beams to notice the figures walking alongside America's forgotten places. I see them now. And once you start seeing, you can never stop. The lantern still burns at Millfield. Henry still makes his rounds. And somewhere out there on the dark highways, other spirits continue their eternal watch, waiting for someone to acknowledge that they're still working, still caring, still protecting the living from dangers they can see coming. Next time you driving late at night and you see something that doesn't quite belong, a figure by the roadside, a light where there shouldn't be one, a shadow that moves wrong, don't dismiss it as imagination. Pull over, look closer. You might be witnessing someone's final act of service played out again and again until the end of time. And if you ever near Grand Island, Nebraska, and you see that exit for Millfield, take it. Park your car on the scale and watch the tracks. Henry is still out there, lantern in hand, making sure we all get home safe. Story 4. Corpse in the road. The thing in the road wasn't supposed to be there. Nothing that mangled, that fresh, that wrong should exist on a lonely Montana highway at 3 in the morning. But my headlights caught it perfectly as I crested the hill on Route 2, and 20 years later, I still see it every time I close my eyes. I was running empty from Seattle to Chicago, taking the northern route to avoid construction delays through Idaho. The load had delivered early, and I was making good time across the empty highways of eastern Montana. Miles and miles of nothing but darkness, rolling hills, and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting from the roadside brush. The corpse appeared in my high beams like something out of a nightmare. It lay spread across both lanes, impossible to miss, impossible to drive around. What was left of it, anyway? No head that I could see. No skin on most of the torso. Just raw flesh and exposed bone gleaming wet in my headlights. Steam rising from the mess in the cold October air. The smell hit me through my air vents immediately. Sweet copper and rot. So strong it made my stomach heave. I slammed on my brakes, bringing 40 tons of truck and trailer to a shuddering stop maybe 50 feet from the thing. I tried to process what I was seeing. Human, definitely, or what was left of one. But the condition it was in made no sense. No vehicle accident could have done that kind of damage. No animal attack either. It looked like something had systematically removed every inch of skin, leaving behind a glistening red sculpture of meat and bone. I reached for my CB radio first, then remembered where I was. Dead zone for miles in every direction. No cell towers, no repeaters, nothing but empty country between me and civilization. My phone showed no signal. I was completely alone with whatever was steaming in the road ahead of me. The smart thing would have been to turn around, find a way back to the last town, report what I found to the authorities. But something about the scene felt wrong beyond just the obvious horror. The body was too perfectly positioned in the center of the road. Too fresh for the remote location. And there was something else. Movement in the darkness beyond my headlight beams. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting green and gold in the scattered light. Low to the ground, spread out in a rough semicircle around my truck. Coyotes, more than I've ever seen in one place. All of them perfectly still, perfectly silent, just watching. I encountered coyotes before on night runs. Usually they scattered at the first sign of headlights. These didn't. They sat like they were waiting for something, like they knew something I didn't. I climbed down from my cab, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. The October air was bitter cold, and my breath formed clouds as I approached the corpse. Up close, the damage was even worse. Whatever had done this had been thorough, professional. The cuts were too clean for animal claws, too precise for an accident. Someone had flensed this body like a butcher preparing meat, but it was the smell that made me step back. Not just death and decay, something else underneath, something chemical and wrong, like formaldehyde mixed with something organic I couldn't identify. That is when I noticed the coyotes had moved closer. They formed a complete circle around me now, maybe 30 of them, all sitting on their haunches like trained dogs. Their eyes never left me, and their mouths hung open in what almost looked like grins. The biggest one, a gray and brown male that had to weigh 60 pounds, sat directly behind the corpse. Between me and my truck, I heard stories about coyote packs attacking humans, but this felt different. More organized, more intelligent, like they were herding me, keeping me in place for some reason I couldn't. Do you understand? I started backing toward my truck, moving slowly, keeping my eyes on the pack leader. The coyotes shifted with me, maintaining their positions, never breaking their circle. The big male tilted his head as I moved, and I swear I saw something that looked like amusement in those yellow eyes. That is when I heard the sound. Wet, sliding, like something heavy being dragged across asphalt. I looked back at the corpse and felt my bladder nearly let go. It was moving. Not much, just a slight shifting, like something was stirring inside the cavity where the chest should have been. The ribs flexed outward slightly, then settled back, then flexed again, like the thing was trying to breathe with lungs that were no longer there. I ran for my truck. The coyotes didn't chase me, but they didn't move out of my way either. I had to shoulder past the pack leader, feeling his coarse fur brush against my leg. He was warm, too warm, and the chemical smell was stronger near him. Like he'd been rolling in whatever had been used to prepare the corpse. I made it to my cab and slammed the door, hands shaking as I reached for the gear shift. In my mirrors, I could see the coyotes repositioning themselves around the body. The pack leader had moved to what I assumed was the head end of the corpse, and he was lowering his muzzle toward the wet mass like he was nuzzling it. I threw the truck into reverse and backed up until I could turn around on the shoulder. As my headlights swept across the scene one last time, I saw something that made me floor the accelerator and not stop until I reached the next town. The corpse was sitting up, Just the torso, since there was no head to speak of. But the spine was vertical, the arms hanging at its sides, and that wet cavity where the chest should have been was expanding and contracting in a steady rhythm. The pack leader sat beside it like a faithful dog, and the other coyotes had formed neat rows behind them, like they were attending some kind of ceremony. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in Malta, Montana, and told them what I'd seen. They took my statement, noted the location, and promised to investigate. I stayed in town that night, too shaken to continue driving. The next morning, a deputy found me at the truck stop. They sent a patrol car to check the location I described. Found nothing. No body, no blood, no sign that anything had happened. Just empty highways stretching in both directions. But there was something else. The asphalt showed scorch marks where I said the corpse had been lying. Perfect human outline burned into the road surface. And scattered around the area were dozens of small bones. Clean, white, picked completely clean of flesh. The deputy asked if I'd been drinking, if I was on any medications, if I had a history of hallucinations. I told him I was stone sober, healthy as a horse, and had been driving trucks for 15 years without incident. He wrote down my answers, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was either lying or crazy. I got back on the road that afternoon, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Did some research when I got home. Found out that stretch of Route 2 had a history of strange incidents. Missing persons, unexplained animal behavior, reports of lights in the sky and sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. Most interesting was a report from 1987. A family of 4 had disappeared while driving that same section of highway. Their car was found a week later. Doors open, no signs of struggle. But the interior was covered in that same chemical smell I encountered. And scattered around the vehicle were small bones, picked clean, that the coroner couldn't identify as human or animal. I never drove that route again. Always took the southern path through Wyoming, even though it added 6 hours to my Chicago runs. But sometimes, late at night on other lonely highways, I did catch that smell in my air vents. Sweet copper and chemicals. And I did check my mirrors for green eyes reflecting in the darkness. Because I figured out what I'd really seen that night in Montana. That wasn't a victim of some random crime. That was bait. Something designed to stop travelers, to get them out of their vehicles in a place where no one could hear them scream. The coyotes weren't scavengers. They were partners, working with something that could flay a human body with surgical precision, something that could make a corpse move after death, something that could burn human-shaped shadows into asphalt. And somewhere out there on the empty highways of America, they were still setting their traps, still waiting for the next driver to stop and investigate something that shouldn't exist. I just thank God I was smart enough to run when I did. Because I have a feeling that if I stayed even a minute longer, those scorch marks on the highway would have been shaped like a truck driver instead of their previous victim. The thing about evil is that it is patient. It can wait decades for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstances. And on the loneliest roads in America, where cell phones dawn to work and help is hours away, it knows that sooner or later, someone will stop. Someone will get out of their vehicle to help what looks like an accident victim. And then the coyotes will have fresh bones to scatter, and the highway will have another scorch mark burned into its surface. I still drive trucks, but I never stop for anything unusual anymore. No matter how much it looks like someone needs help. Because I learned that sometimes the things we think are victims are actually the hunters, and the real predators are the ones smart enough to make us come to them. Story 5. Thing in the fog. The fog came out of nowhere on Highway 80 in eastern Kentucky, rolling across the road like a living thing. One second I had clear visibility for miles ahead. The next I was driving blind through a wall of gray so thick my headlights couldn't penetrate more than 10 feet. That should have been my first warning that this wasn't the natural weather. I'd been hauling auto parts from Detroit to Atlanta, making good time on the midnight run when the fog hit. 22 years of long-haul trucking, and I'd driven through every kind of weather you could imagine. But this was different. The fog didn't drift or swirl like normal fog. It moved with purpose, flowing across the highway in perfect waves, rising from the ground like smoke from some massive underground fire. I slowed to maybe 15 miles per hour and hit my hazard lights. Standard procedure for heavy fog, but that's when the first strange thing happened. My CB radio died. Not static, not interference, Just complete silence, like someone had pulled the plug. Then my GPS went dark. Then my dash light started flickering. Within 30 seconds, every electronic device in my cab had shut down. Engine still running, but everything else was dead. Even my cell phone screen was black, and the thing was fully charged. I'd never seen anything like it. It was like the fog was somehow draining power from everything it touched. I pulled over to the shoulder and set my air brakes. No point trying to drive when I couldn't see the road, couldn't contact dispatch, couldn't even tell where I was. The fog pressed against my windows like it was trying to get inside. So thick it looked almost solid. The temperature outside had dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and frost was forming on my windshield despite the October warmth. That's when I heard the child crying. Faint at first, like it was coming from far away. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sobbing like her heart was broken. The sound seemed to drift through the fog, moving around my truck in slow circles. I rolled down my window to listen better, and the crying got clearer, more desperate. Like she was lost, scared, calling for her mama. Every instinct told me to get out and help. That is what you do when you hear a child in distress. But something about the sound wasn't right. The acoustics were wrong. In fog that thick, sound should be muffled, dampened. But the crying was crystal clear, too perfect, like it was being piped through speakers hidden in the mist. I stayed in my cab and listened as the crying moved in a complete circle around my truck. Always the same distance away, always the same pitch and volume, like it was following a track, or like whatever was making the sound was walking a perfect circle around me in the blind fog. Then the crying started to change. The pitch dropped, became older, more mature. The little girl, its sobs transformed into a woman, weeping. Deeper, more desperate, full of adult pain and loss. But it was still the same voice somehow, just aged up by decades. Like I was hearing the same person at different points in their life, all compressed into a few minutes of supernatural sound. The woman's crying grew louder, more intense, echoing off the fog in ways that defied physics. And then I realized something that made my blood freeze. The voice was familiar. I knew that particular pattern of sobs, that specific way of drawing breath between cries. It sounded like my ex-wife, Sarah. Sarah had left me 3 years earlier, taking our daughter Emma with her. Said she couldn't handle the uncertainty of life with a long-haul trucker. The empty house, the weeks alone, the constant worry about accidents on the road. Our divorce had been bitter, full of tears and accusations. And those tears, those specific sobs of rage and heartbreak, were exactly what I was hearing through the fog. But that was impossible. Sarah was in Phoenix, had been for years. There was no way she could be standing in a Kentucky fog at 2 a.m, crying like she had during our worst fights. The woman's sobs began to fade, but before they disappeared completely, they started changing again. The pitch shifted higher, became different voices. Multiple women now, all crying at once. Their voices blending into a chorus of despair that surrounded my truck like a choir of the damned. I recognized some of the voices. My mother, crying at my father's funeral. My high school girlfriend, weeping when I left for the army. My sister, sobbing over her miscarriage. Every woman who had ever cried in my presence, all their tears collected and played back through the supernatural fog. Then the crying stopped. Complete silence. Even my engine seemed muffled, like the fog was absorbing all sound. I sat in my cab, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. The frost on my windows had gotten thicker, forming patterns that looked almost like faces pressed against the glass from outside. That's when the laughter started. Low at first, barely audible. A woman's chuckle, amused and knowing. But it grew louder quickly, multiplying, becoming dozens of voices laughing at once. Not joyful laughter. This was mocking, cruel, full of malice and satisfaction. Like a crowd of people who had just watched someone suffer a humiliating defeat. The laughter moved around my truck just like the crying had, but faster now, chaotic, overlapping. Some voices were high and shrill, others deep and throaty. Children, its giggles mixed with adult cackles, creating a symphony of mockery that seemed to be directed specifically at me. And again, I recognized voices. Sarah's laugh when she told me she was leaving. My boss laughing when he fired me from my first trucking job. Classmates from high school, laughing at some embarrassment I'd long forgotten. Every moment of humiliation in my life, every time I dip in the butt of someone, is joke, all of it echoing through the fog in perfect, horrible clarity. The laughter grew so loud it seemed to shake my truck. I covered my ears, but the sound came from inside my head now, like the fog had somehow gotten into my brain and was playing my worst memories on repeat. The windows rattled with the vibration, and I could feel the laughter in my chest, in my bones, like it was trying to tear me apart from the inside. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The laughter cut off mid-cackle. The fog began to dissipate, rolling away from the highway in neat, organized waves, like it was being recalled by whatever had summoned it. Within minutes, the night was clear again, stars visible overhead, my headlights illuminating empty road stretching in both directions. My electronics flickered back to life. The CB crackled with normal trucker chatter. My GPS found satellites and recalculated my position. My cell phone buzzed with missed call notifications. Everything was normal, like the fog had never existed. But I knew better. The frost patterns on my windows remained, looking like dozens of faces pressed against the glass. And when I got out to check my truck, I found handprints in the condensation on my trailer. Small prints, like a child, and larger ones from adult hands. Dozens of them, covering the entire side of my trailer like a crowd had been touching it while I sat helpless in the cab. I reported the incident to dispatch, but what was I supposed to say? That I'd been attacked by supernatural fog that played recordings of every painful moment in my life? They'd have ordered a drug test and probably pulled my CDL. Instead, I said I had electrical problems and had to pull over for repairs. Standard equipment failure. Happens all the time. Nothing to investigate. But I did my own investigation when I got home. Researched that stretch of Highway 80, looking for other reports of strange fog or unexplained phenomena. What I found made me wish I kept my mouth shut and never looked into it at all. That section of road has the highest suicide rate of any highway in Kentucky. Over the past 20 years, dozens of people have pulled over in that exact area and taken their own lives. Always single occupants, always late at night. And according to the police reports, many of them were found with expressions of terror on their faces, like they'd been scared to death before they could hurt themselves. Local emergency responders called it the despair mile. They'd gotten used to finding bodies along that stretch, people who had been overwhelmed by something that made them believe death was better than whatever they were facing. But the most disturbing detail came from interviews with the families of the victims. Almost all of them reported that their loved ones had called them shortly before their deaths. Frantic, terrified calls about being trapped in supernatural fog, about hearing voices from their past, about laughter that wouldn't stop. The families thought their loved ones had suffered psychotic breaks. The authorities wrote them off as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by whatever personal crisis had driven these people to suicide. But I knew better. I knew they encountered the same thing I had. The difference was, I managed to resist it. I stayed in my truck, stayed rational, waited it out. But for people who were already on the edge, already carrying guilt and pain and regret, hearing all their worst moments played back in perfect detail was enough to push them over. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a trap, something that fed on despair, that knew exactly how to break down anyone unlucky enough to encounter it. And it was still out there, still rolling across that highway on nights when the conditions were right. I never drove that route again, added 200 miles to my trips just to avoid that stretch of road. But sometimes, on other highways, in other states, I'll see fog forming in the distance and my blood runs cold. Because I know that what I encountered wasn't unique to Kentucky. It was just one manifestation of something larger, something that haunts the lonely roads of America. The fog knows your secrets. It knows your pain. It knows exactly which voices from your past will hurt you the most. And it will play them back with perfect clarity until you break. I survived because I was mentally prepared for psychological warfare. 22 years of dealing with dispatch supervisors, difficult customers, and highway patrol officers had toughened me up. But most people aren't that resilient. Most people have soft spots, vulnerable places where the right combination of guilt and mockery can destroy them completely. So if you ever driving late at night and you see unnatural fog rolling across the road, Don, to stop. Don, to investigate. Don, to listen to the voices it brings with it. Just drive through as fast as you safely can and Don, to look back. Because once the fog knows you can hear it, once it gets inside your head, the laughter never really stops. It's still out there, waiting for the next lonely traveler, the next person carrying enough pain to make good feeding. And when it finds them, they'll hear every cruel word ever spoken to them, every moment of humiliation, every reason they ever had to hate themselves. And then they'll join the voices in the fog, adding their own tears and laughter to the chorus that haunts Highway 80, forever trying to drag other travelers down into the same despair that consumed them. Story 6. Ambush on Highway 83. The human body doesn't lie perfectly straight when it dies. That's what old Jake told me at a truck stop in Bismarck, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Dead people crumple, he said. They fall awkward. They daunt to arrange themselves head to toe across a highway like they reposing for a photograph. I should have listened more carefully to that warning. It was 2 a.m. on Highway 83, somewhere between nowhere and nothing in North Dakota. My CB radio had been silent for the past 100 miles, just static and the occasional burst of Spanish from a distant station bleeding through the atmosphere. The kind of deep prairie darkness where your headlights seem to get swallowed by the void, where the road stretches endlessly forward and you start to question if you were even moving at all. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling machine parts from Minneapolis to Calgary. The load was legal, the paperwork clean, but the pay was good enough that I didn't. To ask why they needed the delivery so fast or why the route took me through the most isolated stretch of highway in North America. That is when I saw them. 2 figures lying across the asphalt, positioned with mathematical precision, head to toe to head, forming a perfect human roadblock in the center of my lane. Even from a quarter mile away, something about the scene felt wrong. Too neat, too deliberate, too still. My foot moved instinctively toward the brake pedal, every decent impulse in my body screaming at me to stop and help. These could be accident victims, people in desperate need of medical attention. Someone as father, someone as son, bleeding out on the cold pavement while I debated whether to trust the paranoid ramblings of an old trucker. But Jake, his voice echoed in my memory. The dead dawn, to lie straight, and these figures were lying straighter than soldiers at attention. I kept my speed steady at 65 and moved into the left lane to go around them. As my headlights swept over the scene, I caught details that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. Both figures were wearing identical dark clothing. Both had their arms positioned at exactly the same angle. Both had their faces turned toward the sky with an unnatural uniformity that no genuine accident could produce. In the split second before I passed them, one of the figures moved. Not the jerky, involuntary movement of someone injured or unconscious. A deliberate, controlled motion. The figure closest to my truck turned his head to track my movement, following the sound of my engine with the calculated patience of a predator watching prey. I floored the accelerator. My Kenworth lurched forward, diesel engine roaring as the speedometer climbed past 70, then 80. In my mirrors, I watched both figures rise from the asphalt with fluid, coordinated movements. No stumbling, no signs of injury or distress. They stood up like actors finishing their performance and walked calmly toward the shoulder of the road. That is when I saw the others. Hidden in the tall grass beside the highway were at least 6 more shapes, dark silhouettes crouched low and motionless until the 2 decoys cleared the roadway. As my truck disappeared into the distance, they emerged from their hiding places like insects crawling out of rotten wood. 8 people total, all working together, all waiting for someone stupid enough or kind enough to stop. I grabbed my CB radio with shaking hands and tried to raise another driver, but the channel was dead. Even the distant Spanish station had faded to static. For the next 50 miles, I was completely alone with the knowledge of what I had almost driven into. The worst part wasn't the trap itself. Ambushes happen. Desperate people do terrible things for money or drugs or just the thrill of violence. What terrified me was the level of organization, the patience, the military precision of their setup. This wasn't random. This was practiced. I made it to the next truck stop just as the sun was coming up, my hands still trembling as I parked between 2 other rigs. The place was nearly empty except for a sleepy attendant and one other driver, a woman in her 50s who was checking her load securement. I told her what I'd seen. She listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the morning sky. Then she told me about the disappearances. Over the past 2 years, 14 truck drivers had vanished on that stretch of Highway 83. Not broken down, not in accidents, just gone. Their trucks found abandoned on the shoulder with no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what happened to the drivers themselves. The woman had heard the stories from other truckers, whispered conversations at fuel stops and truck washes. Some drivers had started taking alternate routes, adding hundreds of miles to their trips just to avoid that section of highway. Others carried extra weapons or traveled in convoys, but most drivers never heard the warnings at all. The woman pulled out a worn notebook and showed me a list of names and dates. Frank Morrison, disappeared March 15th. Sarah Chen, gone April 3rd. Miguel Santos, vanished June 22nd. Each entry included the driver's name, company, and last known location. All of them had been traveling alone. All of them had disappeared between midnight and dawn. I stared at the list, my coffee growing cold in my hands. 14 drivers, 14 people with families, with mortgages, with dogs waiting for them at home. All of them reduced to entries in a notebook that law enforcement apparently didn't care to investigate. The woman closed the notebook and looked me directly in the eyes. She told me about a theory some drivers had developed, a pattern they noticed in the disappearances. The missing truckers hadn't been random victims. They'd all been carrying high-value loads. Electronics, medical supplies, designer clothing. Cargo worth stealing. But here is what made it truly terrifying. The thieves weren't keeping the trucks. Every abandoned rig had been found with its cargo intact, its fuel tank full, its engine still running. Whatever these people wanted, it wasn't the freight. It wasn't even the trucks themselves, which were worth more than most houses. They were harvesting the drivers. The woman wouldn't elaborate on what that meant, but she didn't need to. The implications hung between us like smoke from a house fire, acrid and inescapable. Organ theft, human trafficking, medical experiments, or something worse. Something so beyond normal criminal activity that even hardened truckers couldn't bring themselves to speak it aloud. I asked her why she was keeping the notebook, why she cared about drivers she never met. Her answer was simple and terrifying, because someone had to remember their names. Someone had to keep track of who was disappearing, and someone had to warn the drivers who came after. But the warnings weren't reaching everyone. The Highway Patrol claimed they were investigating, but their reports mentioned equipment failure and driver error, not organized ambushes. The trucking companies kept sending drivers down Highway 83 because it was the fastest route, and time was money. The woman tore a page from her notebook and handed it to me. It contained CB frequencies, truck stop locations, and phone numbers for drivers who were trying to spread the word about the danger. She told me to memorize the information and pass it along to every trucker I met. Then she asked me a question that still haunts my dreams. What if the trap I escaped wasn't the only one? What if there were similar ambush sites on other isolated highways, other groups of people lying in wait for drivers who traveled alone in the dark hours before dawn? I've thought about that question every day for the past 6 months. I've changed my routes, avoided night driving, and carried Jake's warning with me like a talisman against the darkness. But I've also done something else. I've started keeping my own notebook. 3 more drivers have disappeared since that morning at the truck stop. Not on Highway 83, but on other lonely stretches of asphalt where the nearest help is 100 miles away. The pattern is always the same. High-value cargo, solo driver, vanished without a trace. Last week, I got a call from another trucker who heard my story through the CB network. He encountered something similar on a back road in Montana. 2 figures lying across the highway, 2 straight, 2 still. Unlike me, he stopped, but he'd been lucky. When he got out of his truck, he heard voices in the darkness around him, whispers and movement in the tall grass. He jumped back into his cab and driven away just as shapes began emerging from their hiding places. He counted 9 of them. The ambush teams are getting bigger, more organized, more confident, and they spreading to other highways, other states, other hunting grounds where drivers travel alone and help is hours away. I don't know who these people are or what they want with the drivers they take. I don't know how many more names will be added to the notebooks that truckers pass between each other like underground newspapers. But I know this. The next time someone tells you that the most dangerous predators are the ones that look human, believe them. And if you ever find yourself driving alone on a dark highway and you see figures lying too perfectly across the road, remember Jake's words. The dead dawn to lie straight, but the living will, especially when they Re-hunting. Story 7. Watchers of Pine Ridge. The human eye can detect a candle flame from 14 miles away on a clear night. But there are some things that darkness swallows so completely. They seem to pull light into themselves like black holes made of shadow and malice. I learned this truth on a logging road in northern Manitoba, where the trees grow so thick they block out the stars. I had been driving for 16 hours straight when federal regulations forced me to stop. My electronic logbook wouldn't, to let me continue without an 8-hour rest break, and the nearest truck stop was still 200 miles away. The logging road I found myself on wasn't even marked on my GPS, just a dirt trail that branched off Highway 10 and disappeared into the endless Canadian wilderness. I pulled my Peterbilt into a small clearing and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of deep quiet that city people never experience. No traffic, no sirens, no human sounds at all. Just the ticking of my cooling engine and the soft whisper of wind through pine branches that stretched up into the darkness like skeletal fingers. That's when I first felt them watching. It started as a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the primitive awareness that comes from millions of years of human evolution. The same instinct that kept our ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats stalked them through ancient forests. Something was out there, observing me with the patient focus of a predator studying its prey. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. 18 years of long-haul trucking had taught me that isolation plays tricks on the mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I could sense multiple presences in the darkness beyond my truck, as clearly as if they were broadcasting their locations on radar. I reached for my high beams and flooded the forest with light. They were standing at the tree line, perfectly motionless. 3 figures that were clearly humanoid in shape but wrong in every other way. Impossibly tall, at least 8 feet in height, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. But what made my blood freeze was their absolute darkness. My high beams should have illuminated them, should have reflected off clothing or skin or eyes. Instead, the light seemed to be absorbed by their forms, creating patches of deeper blackness against the already dark forest. They were anti-light, negative space in the shape of men, holes in reality where illumination went to die. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But when I opened my eyes, they were still there, still watching, still motionless as statues carved from concentrated night. The largest figure stood directly in front of my truck, perhaps 50 feet away. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying me with curiosity rather than malice. The other 2 flanked it on either side, positioned with military precision. None of them had visible features, no faces or clothing or anything that would mark them as human. Just dark silhouettes that absorbed light and radiated an aura of ancient intelligence. I fumbled for my CB radio, desperate to raise another driver, anyone who could confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But the radio produced only static, as if something was jamming the signal. Even my cell phone showed no bars, which should have been impossible. I was in a dead zone, completely cut off from the outside world. The watchers hadn't to move. For 20 minutes, we remained locked in this silent standoff. Me in my truck with the high beams blazing, them at the forest edge like sentinels guarding some forbidden territory. I couldn't look away, couldn't even blink for more than a second at a time, terrified that any break in my vigilance would give them the opportunity to move closer. Then, without warning, they began to fade, not walking away or melting into the shadows, but actually becoming less solid, less present. Like smoke dissipating in reverse. They grew more transparent until only vague outlines remained. Within moments, they had vanished completely, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. I sat in my cab for another hour, engine running, high beams scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest had returned to its original silence, and the oppressive sense of being watched had lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. Eventually, exhaustion overcame paranoia. I climbed into my sleeper cab and tried to rest, though sleep came in brief, troubled intervals. Every sound from outside sent adrenaline shooting through my system. Every creak of settling metal made me grab for my flashlight. When dawn finally broke through the pine canopy, I inspected the area where the figures had stood. The ground showed no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence that anything had been there at all. But 50 feet from where the largest figure had positioned itself, I found something that made my hands shake. A circle of dead grass, perfectly round, about 6 feet in diameter. The vegetation hadn't He'd been burned or crushed, just drained of life. The grass blades stood upright but were completely colorless, brittle as spun glass. In the center of the circle was a depression in the earth, as if something incredibly heavy had stood there for a very long time. I took photos with my phone, though the images came out strangely distorted, filled with dark spots and streaks that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. When I tried to upload them to social media later, my phone crashed repeatedly, finally deleting the files entirely as if they were infected with some kind of digital virus. The drive out of that forest felt endless. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide watching figures. Every patch of darkness looked deeper than it should. I kept my windows up and my doors locked, even though I knew that glass and metal would provide no protection against creatures that could absorb light itself. I didn't tell anyone about the encounter for 3 months. Who would believe such a story? But the memory haunted me, and I found myself researching similar experiences online. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The sightings went back generations. Indigenous communities throughout northern Canada had stories of shadow people who watched travelers from the deep forest. They were called different names by different tribes, but the descriptions were always consistent. Impossibly tall figures of absolute darkness who observed humans with ancient intelligence. According to the legends, these watchers were older than human civilization. They had been in the forests when the first people crossed the land bridge from Asia, and they would remain long after humanity was gone. They were neither good nor evil in human terms, but something far more alien. Observers from a realm that existed parallel to our own, occasionally breaking through when the barriers grew thin. The stories claimed that seeing the watchers was a sign, not of danger, exactly, but of proximity to something much larger and more incomprehensible than human minds could process. They appeared to those who had wandered too close to the edges of reality, into places where the normal rules no longer applied. Most unsettling were the accounts from truckers who had encountered similar figures. A driver in northern Minnesota described shadow people standing in formation beside Highway 2. Another trucker reported seeing them near the Alaska Highway, motionless observers who watched his truck pass before vanishing into the wilderness. But it was a blog post from a driver named Marcus Thompson that truly terrified me. He had encountered the watchers on the same logging road where I had stopped, in the same clearing, at almost the exact same time of night. His description matched mine perfectly, down to the circle of dead grass and the photographs that wouldn't save. Marcus had posted his account 2 years before my encounter. According to the blog's timestamp, he had been planning to return to the area with better cameras and recording equipment. There were no further posts after that announcement. His profile showed no activity. It was as if Marcus Thompson had simply vanished from the internet entirely. I tried to research Marcus further, but found no trace of him in trucker databases, social media, or public records. Either he had never existed, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase every trace of his presence online. That discovery led me down a deeper rabbit hole. I found references to other truckers who had posted about shadow people encounters, only to disappear from digital existence shortly afterward. Forums dedicated to paranormal trucking experiences were filled with deleted posts and suspended accounts. Someone or something was monitoring these discussions and silencing those who spoke too openly about what they had seen. The implications were staggering. If the watchers were real, if they were actively monitoring human awareness of their existence, then sharing this story could be putting me in danger. But the alternative was worse, allowing other drivers to stumble into encounters without any warning or preparation. I started carrying different equipment on my runs. Night vision cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, devices that I hoped might capture evidence that couldn't be digitally erased. But in 6 months of driving through remote areas, I never encountered the watchers again. Sometimes I wondered if they had moved on, if whatever they were studying in that forest clearing had been completed. Other times I suspected they were still there, still watching, but now aware that I knew about their presence. The worst possibility was that they were following me. 3 weeks ago, I was parked at a truck stop in Montana when another driver approached my cab. He was clearly shaken, his hands trembling as he knocked on my window. When I rolled it down, he told me about an encounter he had the previous night on a back road in northern Idaho. 3 tall figures standing at the forest edge. Absolute darkness that swallowed light. A perfect circle of dead vegetation. Photographs that wouldn't save. I gave him my phone number and told him to call if he wanted to talk more about what he'd seen. But when I tried to reach him the next day, the number he'd given me was disconnected. The truck stopped as security cameras had malfunctioned during the time window when we despoken, showing only static and digital snow. I am sharing this story now because I believe the watchers are becoming more active. More truckers are reporting encounters, and more of those truckers are disappearing from digital existence afterward. Whatever these entities are, whatever they re-studying, the frequency of contact is increasing. If you a driver and you encounter figures that absorb light rather than reflecting it, done to try to photograph them, done to post about it online, done to investigate further. Just drive away and try to forget what you saw. Some knowledge isn't meant for human minds. Some watchers have been observing us far longer than we have been aware of their presence. And some truths are too dangerous to remember, because remembering them means being remembered in return. Story 8. Voice on Channel 19. Dead air on a CB radio sounds different than regular silence. It has weight to it, a thickness that seems to press against your eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. After 23 years of driving long haul, I thought I knew every sound that could come through those speakers. I was wrong. It was 3:15 in the morning on Interstate 40, somewhere between Oklahoma City and Little Rock. The kind of desolate stretch where truck stops are 50 miles apart and the only company you have is your own headlights cutting through endless darkness. My CB had been quiet for hours, not even the usual late-night chatter from other drivers fighting sleep and boredom. Then it crackled to life with a voice that made my blood freeze. The transmission was broken, filled with static that sounded like grinding metal and winter wind. But through the electronic snow came words that were unmistakably human, desperate, and impossibly distant. Breaker 19. Anyone out there? Please. I'm lost. So cold. The voice faded in and out like a radio station on the edge of its broadcast range. But we were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any repeater tower that could carry a signal this week. And there was something else wrong with the transmission, something that made the hair on my arm stand. The voice sounded old. Not the voice of an old man, but old in the way that recordings from the 1940s sound different from modern audio. Hollow and distant, as if it was coming from the bottom of a very deep hole. I keyed my microphone and responded. This is eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 247. I got your transmission. What? So you're 20. Static filled the channel for nearly a minute. Then the voice came back, clearer this time but somehow even more disturbing. Coordinates. 35.442 north, 94.789 west. Truck went through the guardrail. To get out. Water rising. The transmission cut to dead air, leaving me alone with the hum of my diesel engine and the sound of my own heartbeat. I grabbed my GPS unit and punched in the coordinates the voice had given me. The device took longer than usual to calculate, its screen flickering as if struggling with data it couldn't quite process. When the location finally appeared, I nearly drove off the road. The coordinates were pointing to a spot roughly 2 miles south of my current position, deep in the Arkansas River Valley. But according to my GPS, there was no road at those coordinates. Just water, marsh, and heavily wooded bottomland that had been undisturbed for decades. I should have kept driving. Should have written it off as some kind of radio skip, atmospheric conditions bouncing signals from hundreds of miles away. But the desperation in that voice haunted me. Someone was in trouble, calling for help that might never come. I took the next exit and followed back roads toward the coordinates, my headlights revealing a landscape that grew increasingly wild and isolated. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing more than 2 parallel tire ruts disappearing into thick forest. My truck wasn't built for this terrain, but I pushed forward, branches scraping against my trailer as I descended into the river bottom. The GPS showed I was getting close to the coordinates, but all I could see was dense woodland and the occasional glint of water through the trees. Then I found the guardrail. It was old, much older than the interstate system. Heavy steel painted a faded yellow-green that hadn't been used by highway departments since the 1970s. A section of it had been torn away, leaving twisted metal and concrete supports that disappeared down a steep embankment toward the river. I parked my truck and grabbed a flashlight, following the scar in the earth where something heavy had crashed through the forest decades ago. Broken trees had regrown around the impact site, but the path of destruction was still visible if you knew what to look for. At the bottom of the embankment, half submerged in black water and covered with 30 years of mud and vegetation, I found the truck. It was a 1970s-era Kenworth, the kind of cab-over design that hadn't been manufactured since the early 1980s. The impact had driven it nose first into the riverbank, burying the cab so deep that only the top of the sleeper compartment was visible above the waterline. My flashlight beam caught a reflection from inside the partially submerged cab, and I realized with horror that the driver's side window was still intact. Through the muddy glass, I could see the skeletal remains of a human figure still strapped into the driver's seat. I should have called the police immediately. Should have backed away from this scene of ancient tragedy and let professionals handle the recovery. Instead, I found myself wading into the murky water, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The closer I got to the truck, the stronger my CB radio reception became. Static filled my earpiece. Then that same desperate voice, clearer now than it had been on the highway. Thank God, someone finally came. Been calling for hours. Water keeps rising. Can you reach my radio? The voice was coming from inside the submerged cab. My flashlight illuminated the interior through the grimy glass, and I could see that the radio was still mounted to the dashboard, its microphone hanging from a coiled cord that swayed gently in the current. But the skeletal remains in the driver's seat hadn't moved, couldn't move, had been dead for decades. The microphone swayed toward the remains of the driver's mouth, and I heard the voice again, broadcast directly from the radio in the cab to the receiver on my belt. Cold. So cold, water coming in faster. Nobody knows where I am. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the muddy riverbank. The flashlight beam wavered across the scene, revealing details that my mind struggled to process. The dashboard clock in the cab was still running, its digital display showing 3:47 a.m. Impossible after 30 years underwater, but undeniably real. The voice continued its desperate plea, and I realized it wasn't addressing me. It was a loop, a recording of the driver's final moments played endlessly through radio equipment that should have been destroyed decades ago. I fumbled for my cell phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal bars, despite being in an area that should have had coverage. My GPS unit had also stopped working, its screen showing nothing but error messages. The only electronic device that functioned was my CB radio, which continued to broadcast the voice of a man who had died calling for help that never arrived. I climbed back up the embankment and returned to my truck, but the transmission followed me. Every few minutes, the same desperate coordinates, the same plea for rescue, the same description of rising water and approaching death. It was as if the driver's final moments had been burned into the radio waves themselves, creating a psychic recording that played whenever someone came close enough to receive it. I drove back to the interstate, but the voice followed me for another 20 miles before finally fading to static. When I reached the next truck stop, I asked other drivers if they had heard any unusual CB chatter. None of them had picked up anything on Channel 19. The next day, I called the Arkansas State Police and reported the location of the submerged truck. They seemed skeptical at first, but agreed to send an investigation team to the coordinates I provided. 3 days later, I received a call from a detective who sounded confused and more than a little disturbed. They had found the truck exactly where I described it, along with the remains of a driver named Thomas Earl Morrison. According to their records, Morrison had been reported missing in October 1987 while hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Texas to Michigan. His truck had apparently left the highway during a storm, crashed through the old guardrail, and plunged into the river valley. The strange part was that the truck's CB radio was still functional despite being underwater for over 30 years. The investigator couldn't explain how that was possible, but confirmed that it was still broadcasting on Channel 19 when they found it. More disturbing was what they discovered in the truck's logbook. Morrison's final entry was dated October 23, 1987, at 3:47 a.m., the exact time I had seen on the dashboard clock when I found the wreck. According to the logbook, Morrison had been trying to radio for help for over 4 hours before the water finally reached his cab. He had broadcast his coordinates repeatedly, begging for rescue that never came. Highway patrol records from that night showed no reports of a missing truck, no emergency calls from the area. Thomas Morrison had died alone in that cab, calling out on a radio frequency that no one was monitoring. The detective asked me how I had known to look for the truck in such an isolated location. I told him about the CB transmission I had received, the coordinates broadcast by a voice that sounded exactly like a man calling for help. There was a long silence on the phone before he responded. The investigator told me that Morrison's CB radio was still transmitting when they pulled it from the water. still broadcasting the same desperate message, the same coordinates, the same plea for rescue. They had recorded several minutes of the transmission before the radio finally went silent. He played the recording for me over the phone, and I recognized the voice immediately. It was the same transmission I had received on the highway, the same words that had led me to the crash site. But now I understood what I was really hearing. It wasn't a ghost or a supernatural phenomenon. It was something far more tragic. Thomas Morrison, his final moments, somehow preserved in electronic memory and broadcast endlessly into the void, waiting for someone to finally hear his call for help. The detective told me that Morrison had a wife and 2 young children when he disappeared. They had never learned what happened to him, had spent 30 years wondering if he was alive somewhere, had never been able to properly grieve or move on with their lives. Thanks to a CB transmission from beyond the grave, they finally had answers. They could lay Thomas Morrison to rest and begin to heal from 3 decades of uncertainty. But I still wonder about all the other voices that might be out there, trapped in endless loops of desperation and fear. How many drivers have died alone, calling for help on frequencies that no one monitors? How many final transmissions are still echoing through the electronic void, waiting for someone to receive them? Sometimes, late at night when the highways are empty and the CB channels are quiet, I scan through the frequencies looking for voices that shouldn't exist. Most nights I hear nothing but static and distant chatter from living drivers. But occasionally, very rarely, I pick up transmissions that sound too old, too desperate, too lost to be coming from anyone still alive. Coordinates to places where no roads should exist. Pleas for help that are decades too late to answer. I write down every one of them, because everyone deserves to be found eventually. Everyone deserves someone to hear their final call for help, even if the rescue comes 30 years too late. Story 9. Light behind the storm, the human brain can only process so much strangeness before it starts making excuses. Weather balloons, military exercises, swamp gas reflecting Venus. Anything to avoid accepting that some things in this universe operate by rules we don't. Do you understand? I learned this lesson on Interstate 70 in Kansas, where the wheat fields stretch endlessly under skies so vast they make you feel like an insect crawling across the bottom of an ocean. The storm hit without warning just past the Colby exit, a wall of black clouds that rose from the horizon like a tsunami made of electricity and rage. One moment I was cruising through clear evening air. The next I was fighting to keep my Kenworth on the road as hurricane-force winds tried to flip my trailer sideways. Lightning struck the highway so close I could taste metal in the air. Thunder crashed with enough force to rattle my teeth, and the rain came down in sheets so thick my wipers were useless against the deluge. I had no choice but to pull over at the next rest area and wait for the storm to pass. The rest area was little more than a concrete building and a few picnic tables, but it offered some protection from the wind. I parked my truck facing east so I could monitor the storm, its movement, watching as lightning illuminated the prairie and stark. That is when the power went out. Not just the rest area lights, but everything. The entire landscape plunged into absolute darkness, as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off the world. No glow from distant towns, no scattered farmhouse lights, nothing but the occasional lightning flash to prove that anything existed beyond my windshield. The blackout stretched as far as I could see in every direction, which in Kansas means it covered hundreds of square miles. A power grid failure on that scale shouldn't have been possible from a single lightning strike, but there was no other explanation for what I was witnessing. Then I saw the light behind the clouds. It started as a faint blue glow, barely visible through the storm clouds that continued to roil overhead. At first I thought it might be lightning reflecting off something in the atmosphere, or maybe emergency flares from an aircraft in distress. But the light didn't flash or flicker like normal electrical phenomena. It moved with deliberate, calculated purpose. The glow grew brighter and more defined, revealing itself to be enormous beyond comprehension. This wasn't a distant star or planet or any natural light source. It was something massive moving behind the cloud layer, casting an ethereal blue radiance that seemed to penetrate the storm itself. I rolled down my window despite the rain and listened for engine noise, helicopter rotors, anything that might identify what I was seeing. But there was no sound at all except the wind and the diminishing rumble of thunder. Whatever was up there moved in complete silence, gliding through the sky like a whale swimming through deep ocean currents. The light began to descend. As it dropped lower, the blue radiance intensified, turning the storm clouds translucent and revealing glimpses of the object behind them. What I saw defied every assumption I had about aircraft, weather phenomena, or anything else that belonged in Earth's atmosphere. The thing was disc-shaped and absolutely massive, easily the size of several city blocks. Its surface seemed to ripple like liquid metal, constantly shifting and reforming as if the entire craft was made of some substance that existed halfway between solid matter and pure energy. The blue light emanated from every part of its surface, pulsing in patterns that suggested intelligence, communication, purpose. It hovered directly over the rest area for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I sat frozen in my cab, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might draw its attention. The craft was so large that it blocked out half the sky, its presence creating a pressure change that I could feel in my bones. Then it began to scan. Beams of intense white light erupted from the underside of the craft, sweeping across the landscape in methodical patterns. The beams were pencil-thin but incredibly bright, illuminating everything they touched with harsh, clinical precision. I watched them move across the wheat fields, the highway, the empty buildings of distant farms. One of the beams found my truck. The light hit my windshield and everything inside my cab became visible in stark detail. I could feel the beam examining me, cataloging me, recording every aspect of my presence in this place at this moment. The sensation was indescribable, like being dissected by pure intelligence that could see through my skin, my thoughts, my memories. I wanted to run but couldn't. To move, wanted to scream but had no voice. The scanning beam held me paralyzed while something vast and alien studied me with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining bacteria under a microscope. The beam lingered on me for perhaps 30 seconds before moving on to scan the rest area building, the picnic tables, every inch of the surrounding landscape. Whatever information it was gathering, I was apparently just one small piece of a much larger survey. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scanning stopped. The beams retracted into the craft, the blue glow began to fade, and the massive object started to rise back into the storm clouds. Within minutes, it had disappeared completely, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. But the most disturbing part was what happened next. The storm simply ended. Not gradually, not the way natural weather patterns dissipate, but instantly. The wind stopped blowing, the rain ceased falling, the lightning vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. The black clouds dissolved into wisps of vapor that scattered across a suddenly clear sky filled with normal stars. The power came back on across the entire region. Farmhouse lights twinkling to life in the distance like someone had reconnected a massive circuit breaker. Within minutes, the landscape looked exactly as it had before the storm, as if the entire weather event had been artificially generated and then artificially terminated. I sat in my truck for another hour, staring up at the normal night sky and trying to convince myself that I had imagined the entire encounter. Fatigue, optical illusions, ball lightning, anything that could explain what I had seen without requiring me to accept that I had witnessed something genuinely extraterrestrial. But when I finally started my engine and pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't stop checking my mirrors. Every distant aircraft light, every radio tower beacon, every reflection off my trailer made me wonder if I was being followed. If the scanning beam had marked me somehow, if whatever intelligence controlled that craft was still monitoring my movements. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, pushing my body beyond its legal driving limits because the alternative was spending another night alone under those vast Kansas skies. But even in the city, surrounded by traffic and streetlights and all the comforting signs of human civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the following weeks, I researched weather patterns for that night and found no official record of the storm I had experienced. No National Weather Service advisories, no power company reports of grid failures, no other witnesses who had reported unusual atmospheric phenomena. According to every official source, the evening of June 15th had been clear and calm across central Kansas. But I found something else in my research that made my blood run cold. UFO sighting databases contain dozens of reports from rural Kansas dating back to the 1960s, all describing similar encounters. Massive storms that appeared and disappeared without warning. Blue lights moving behind cloud cover. Scanning beams that examined vehicles and buildings with methodical precision. Most disturbing were the reports from truck drivers who claimed to have been scanned by the beams. Several of them described the same sensation I had experienced, the feeling of being studied by an intelligence that could see through flesh and bone. But many of these drivers had reported additional encounters, return visits from the craft that suggested ongoing surveillance. Some of them had stopped filing reports entirely, their accounts ending abruptly as if they had decided to stop talking about their experiences, or had been convinced to stop. I found one forum post from a driver named Mike Hendricks who claimed the blue lights had been following him for years, appearing during storms across multiple states. His final post was chilling in its resignation. He wrote that he had given up trying to outrun them, that he now accepted his role as a subject in whatever study they were conducting. Mike's post was dated 3 months before my encounter. There were no subsequent entries from his account. I started carrying different equipment in my truck after that night. Cameras with night vision capabilities, electromagnetic field detectors, anything that might record evidence of another encounter. But in 2 years of driving through Kansas and other rural areas, I never experienced another artificial storm or saw another blue light behind the clouds. Sometimes I wonder if that single scanning session was all they needed. Maybe I am now part of some vast database of human subjects, my biological and psychological profile stored in computers beyond our understanding. Maybe every truck driver who gets scanned becomes a permanent research subject, monitored from a distance but never contacted again unless the data requires updating. Or maybe the scanning process changed me in ways I don't fully understand. Maybe it implanted some kind of tracking technology that allows them to monitor me without my knowledge. Maybe every time I look up at the night sky and wonder if they are still out there, they are looking back down at me with the same detached scientific curiosity. The worst possibility is that the encounter wasn't random. Maybe they have been studying human transportation patterns for decades, using our highway system as a laboratory to observe how we move across the landscape. Maybe truck drivers are ideal subjects because we isolated, mobile, and accustomed to spending long hours alone under open skies. Maybe we were all being watched, cataloged, studied by intelligences that see our entire civilization as nothing more than an interesting biological phenomenon worth documenting before it inevitably destroys itself. I still drive the same routes through Kansas and other rural areas, but I watch the weather reports more carefully now. When storms approach without proper meteorological explanation, when the radar shows formations that don't match natural patterns, I find alternative routes or wait them out in populated areas. Because I know now that some storms err in natural phenomena. They recover stories, camouflage for activities that our governments either can't detect or choose not to acknowledge. And sometimes, when you alone under those vast American skies, you might find yourself being studied by eyes that see our entire world as nothing more than a laboratory specimen waiting to be examined. Story 10. Cemetery Guardian. I should have listened to the old-timer at the truck stop. His weathered hands gripped his coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this world as he warned me about mile marker 247 on Highway 83. Don, you ever stop past that cemetery? He whispered, his voice cracking with fear. That place ain't right. Something has been watching that road for decades. But I was exhausted. 22 hours behind the wheel, hauling refrigerated goods from Denver to Kansas City, and my logbook was screaming for a mandatory rest break. When I saw that stretch of empty highway with the wide shoulder just past the old Riverside Cemetery, I figured it was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and most importantly, legal. The cemetery sat about a quarter-mile back from the road, barely visible through the twisted oak trees that seemed to lean away from the rusted iron gates. Crooked headstones jutted from overgrown grass like broken teeth. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time and the living alike. I'd seen hundreds of small-town graveyards during my 15 years of long-haul trucking, but something about this one made my skin crawl. I backed my rig onto the shoulder, set the air brakes, and killed the engine. No traffic, no wind, not even the usual cricket chorus you'd expect in rural Kansas. Just dead silence pressing against my eardrums like cotton. I climbed into the sleeper berth, set my alarm for 8 hours, and tried to shake the feeling that invisible eyes were watching me from those dark trees. The curtains were drawn tight, but I couldn't escape the sensation of being studied, cataloged, measured by something that didn't belong to the world of the living. Sleep came eventually, heavy and dreamless. The banging started at 3:17 in the morning. I jolted awake to thunderous impacts against my trailer that shook the entire cab like a giant fist. Boom, boom, boom. Each strike sent vibrations through the frame that rattled my teeth and made the windows buzz in their seals. My heart hammered as I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the curtains. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, silver under the moonlight. No cars, no people, no explanation for the violent assault on my truck. The banging continued, moving along the length of the trailer from back to front. Each impact was precise, deliberate, as if something was systematically testing every panel, every rivet, looking for weakness. The sound was wrong too. Not the hollow ring of metal being struck, but a deeper, more organic thud that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I reached for my CB radio with shaking hands. Breaker 19, this is westbound Willie at mile marker 247. Anyone out there? I got some kind of situation here. Static, dead air. Even the usual chatter from overnight drivers had vanished. The banging grew more aggressive, more insistent. Boom, 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 like a heartbeat made of thunder. My cab rocked with each strike, and I realized with growing terror that whatever was doing this possessed inhuman strength. No person could generate that kind of force, that kind of sustained, methodical violence. I grabbed my maglite and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on gravel. The night air was unnaturally cold for August, and my breath misted despite the 80-degree temperature when I stopped. The banging ceased the moment my feet touched the ground. Silence again, absolute and complete. I walked the length of my trailer, playing the flashlight beam across every surface. No dents, no scratches, no footprints in the soft shoulder dirt, no rocks, no debris, nothing that could explain the assault I just endured. The trailer looked exactly as it had when I parked, pristine and undisturbed. But the silence was wrong now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty highway. It was the held breath silence of a predator preparing to strike. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fire up the engine and put miles between myself and this cursed stretch of road. I climbed back into the cab and turned the key. The diesel engine coughed, wheezed, and died. I tried again. Nothing but the grinding of the starter motor. On the third attempt, the engine finally caught, and I'd never been so grateful to hear that familiar rumble. As I released the air brakes and pulled back onto the highway, I glanced in my side mirror at the cemetery. For just a moment, I swore I saw a figure standing among the headstones, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned undertaker, his coat. It raised one skeletal hand as if waving goodbye, and its eyes glowed with the cold light of marsh gas. I floored the accelerator and didn't slow down until I reached the Kansas City terminal 14 hours later. When I told my dispatcher about the delay, I blamed mechanical problems. How could I explain what really happened? That I encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that guards the dead and punishes the living who dare disturb their eternal watch? The old-timer at the truck stop knew, though. When I saw him again 2 weeks later, he took one look at my face and nodded grimly. You stopped past that cemetery, didn't you, son? He said. Lucky you. Still breathing. Most folks who ignore that warning dawn to make it back to tell the tale. I've been driving long haul for 23 years now, and I've seen my share of strange things on America's lonely highways. But I'll never forget mile marker 247, and I'll never again ignore the warnings of old-timers who've seen too much of what lurks in the dark spaces between towns. Some roads are meant to be traveled, others are meant to be avoided, and some, like that cursed stretch past Riverside Cemetery, are hunting grounds for things that should have stayed buried long ago. The cemetery guardian is still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next foolish driver who thinks they know better than the wisdom of the road. Story 11. Shadow that warned him I should have died that night on Interstate 70. The shadow made sure I didn't. My name is Marcus, and I've been hauling freight across America for 17 years. I've seen everything these highways can throw at you. Drunk drivers weaving through lanes at 3 a.m., ice storms that turn asphalt into glass, fog so thick you can see your own headlights cutting through it. But nothing prepared me for what happened last October on that godforsaken stretch between Kansas City and Denver. The load was routine, auto parts from Missouri to Colorado, 48,000 pounds of metal and plastic riding behind my Kenworth. I'd driven this route dozens of times, knew every truck stop, every way station, every mile marker between here and there. What I didn't know was that something else knew this road too. Something that had been watching drivers like me for years, decades maybe. The trouble started around midnight near Hays, Kansas. That is when the coffee stopped working. I'd been fighting drowsiness for the past hour, chugging gas station coffee like it was medicine. but my eyelids felt like they had weights attached. The yellow lines on the highway blurred together. My head bobbed forward, jerked back up. Classic highway hypnosis, the kind that kills truckers every day in America. I should have pulled over at the next exit, found a rest area, caught some sleep. Should have followed the rules I hammered into rookie drivers 100 times. Instead, I cranked the radio louder, rolled down the windows, and kept driving. Biggest mistake of my life. The road stretched endlessly ahead, nothing but darkness and the occasional pair of headlights in the opposite lane. No moon that night, just the weak glow of my dashboard and the twin cones of light from my headlamps pushing back the black. The heater was broken, so cold October air rushed through the cab, carrying the smell of winter wheat and something else. Something rotting. That is when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my brain. A shadow beside the road, maybe 20 feet tall, standing perfectly still in the scrub grass. But shadows done to stand. Shadows done to have shape when there's nothing to cast them. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Still there, the figure was completely black, like someone had cut a hole in reality itself. No features, no texture, just a void in the shape of a man. But not quite a man. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, arms that hung down past where knees should be. And it was facing me, watching my truck barrel down the interstate at 70 miles per hour. My foot eased off the accelerator. Every survival instinct I developed in nearly 2 decades of long-haul driving screamed at me to gun it, to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. But I couldn't to look away, couldn't process what I was seeing. Then it moved, not walked, not stepped, just shifted position like a film frame had been cut and spliced. 1 second it was standing beside the road. The next second it was closer, much closer, right at the edge of the pavement, where the white line disappeared into gravel. My heart hammered against my ribs. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the freezing air rushing through the windows. I'd seen enough horror movies to know this was the part where the smart guy turns around, gets the hell out of there, lives to tell the story. But there was nowhere to turn around. No exits for miles. Just me, my rig, and that impossible shadow watching from the roadside. It raised one arm. The movement was fluid, wrong, like watching someone move underwater in slow motion. The arm extended, pointing directly at my cab, directly at me. And in that moment, every molecule of drowsiness vanished from my body. Adrenaline flooded my system like a dam had burst. My vision sharpened. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every nerve ending fired at once. I was completely, utterly awake. The shadow held that position for maybe 3 seconds. Pointing, warning. Then it simply wasn't there anymore. Not fading, not walking away. Gone, like it had never existed at all. But the adrenaline kept pumping. My heart kept racing. Something deep in my brain, some primitive part that remembered when humans were prey animals, screamed that I was still in danger. Terrible danger, the kind that kills you if you were not ready for it. I kept driving, hands shaking on the wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds. Nothing behind me but empty highway. Nothing ahead but darkness and those endless yellow lines. The radio crackled with static, weather reports, late-night talk shows. Normal sounds from a normal world. But I didn't feel normal anymore. I felt like I'd been marked, chosen, warned about something I couldn't understand. 1 mile passed, then another. My speedometer held steady at 70. The adrenaline started to fade, replaced by confusion and the creeping return of fatigue. Maybe I'd been hallucinating after all. Maybe 3 days of 4-hour sleep cycles had finally caught up with me. Maybe the curve came out of nowhere. Highway 70 through Kansas is supposed to be straight. Arrow straight for hundreds of miles, built for speed and efficiency across the plains. But suddenly the road bent to the right, a sharp curve that hadn't been there on any of my previous runs. My headlights swept across the guardrail, across the grass, across something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Cars, dozens of them, twisted and burning and scattered across both lanes like a child's broken toys. I stood on the brakes. 48,000 pounds of truck and trailer screamed in protest, tires smoking against asphalt, air brakes hissing like angry snakes. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled the cab. My seatbelt cut into my chest as momentum tried to launch me through the windshield. The rig shuddered to a stop maybe 50 feet from the wreckage. Steam rose from the crumpled vehicles ahead. I could hear the ping and crackle of cooling metal, The hiss of ruptured radiators. The distant wail of sirens still miles away. Fresh accident. Minutes old, maybe less. If I'd been asleep at the wheel, if that shadow hadn't appeared, if I hadn't been flooded with that impossible burst of alertness, I would have plowed straight into that pile up at 70 miles per hour. Would have added my name to whatever casualty list was about to be written. Would have died in a fireball of diesel fuel and twisted steel. Just another statistic in the Department of Transportation's annual report on trucking fatalities. But I didn't die because something had warned me. Something that shouldn't exist had pointed at my truck, had somehow forced my brain awake, had saved my life by making sure I was alert enough to stop in time. I sat in my cab for 20 minutes, engine idling, emergency flashers painting the wreckage in rhythmic red pulses. State troopers arrived first, then ambulances, then fire trucks. I gave my statement to a young officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Told him about the fatigue, about seeing the curve, about managing to stop before hitting the accident. Didn't mention the shadow. Didn't mention the impossible thing that had pointed at me from beside the road. Who would believe it? Hell, I barely believed it myself. The officer said I was lucky. Said most drivers would have been going too fast to stop, would have made the accident 10 times worse. Said I'd probably saved lives by not adding to the pile-up. He was right about the luck part, just wrong about the source. They routed traffic around the wreckage for 6 hours while crews cleared the scene. I caught some sleep in my sleeper berth, but every time I closed my eyes I saw that shadow pointing at me. Warning me, saving me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. 3 weeks later, I was hauling electronics from Phoenix to Chicago when I stopped at a truck stop outside Flagstaff. Late dinner, fuel, shower, the usual routine. In the driver's lounge, I got talking with an older guy named Ray who had been driving longer than I'd been alive. Weathered face, permanent squint from decades of highway glare, hands that looked like leather gloves. Ray had stories, every old-timer does, but when I mentioned the stretch of 70 through Kansas, something changed in his expression. Got serious, leaned forward, lowered his voice. He'd seen it too. Not the same night, not the same year, but the same thing. A shadow by the roadside, impossibly tall and thin, pointing at his truck. And just like me, the sighting had flooded him with adrenaline, had shocked him awake just in time to avoid disaster. In his case, it was a drunk driver in a pickup truck, wrong way on the interstate, headlights off. Without that burst of alertness, Ray would have met that truck head-on at a combined speed of over 100 miles per hour. He called it the Highway Guardian. Said truckers had been reporting similar sightings for decades, always in different locations, always just before some kind of catastrophe. Always described the same way, a shadow in the shape of a man, but wrong somehow, standing by the roadside and pointing. Ray had a theory, said maybe all those drivers who died on America's highways over the years, maybe some of them never really left. Maybe they were still out there, trying to save others from a fate they couldn't escape themselves. Sounded crazy when he said it, but then again, everything about that night sounded crazy. They've been driving the same routes for months now, but I haven't seen the shadow again. Maybe it only appears when you need it most. Maybe it's out there right now, watching some other driver fighting sleep, getting ready to point and warn and save another life. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe 3 decades of highway miles and diesel fumes have finally broken something in my brain. Maybe that shadow was just a hallucination, and I got lucky with my timing at that accident scene. But late at night, when I'm alone in my cab with nothing but darkness ahead and the yellow lines disappearing under my wheels, I find myself scanning the roadside, looking for shadows that shouldn't exist, hoping I'd never see one again, because seeing it would mean someone else was about to die. And hoping that if I do need saving again, that impossible guardian will be there, pointing through the darkness, giving me the gift of one more sunrise, one more mile, one more chance to make it home alive. The highway keeps its secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets keep us too.